Hi, Evan here. Um, Today is going to be a little talk day, and it's going to be about learning Latin and the problems of learning Latin, particularly problems with how Latin is often taught. From the fall of Rome until around the mid 1700s, Latin was still the workhorse language of Europe, and it was taught in a very different way to the way, that it is predominantly taught now. Latin is stuck in a time warp when it comes to teaching, and as a result, very, very few people are able to really read the language, as in deal with it in their heads as Latin. The primary route into Latin nowadays is through grammar. Latin's not really taught or even considered as worthwhile as a language. It's treated as this great intellectual exercise, a bit like mathematics. Often it's sold on the back of false virtues, that it encourages critical thinking, that it makes people intelligent. Well, it's all a load of codswallop, quite frankly. Yes, if you do go about trying to learn Latin by memorizing charts and declensions and lists of rules, well, yes, it's going to be extremely difficult because the human mind does not learn language that way. We have in our brains language machines. If you stick a child or even an adult into a foreign language environment, after a time, through interacting with the people speaking that language, the brain starts to pick up the rules, and through listening intently for a long time, eventually you get to the point where you can speak. If you stick a little child into a new language environment, well, that child's not going to suddenly start speaking the new language. They're going to listen and listen and listen and listen. And eventually, after a year, maybe 2 years, they'll start to speak. And the language itself will be acquired in a particular pattern. It doesn't matter in a classroom how a teacher teaches the language. The brain will acquire the patterns of that language in a particular order depending on what language it is. So the question is, how do you go about learning Latin? Well, I'd say one way you don't learn Latin is by using a book like Wheelock. If you're reading a Latin text and you find yourself questioning what adjective goes with what noun, where the verb is, if you find yourself analyzing it, breaking it up into pieces as you're reading it, well, you are not reading Latin and you have not succeeded. What you need to do is start off your learning in a more natural way. This is how it was done in the Renaissance. You'd start children off with very simple texts and only very, very gradually introduce them to very basic grammatical information. Comenius, for example, recommended that the students actually would have a little declension table on the table in front of them, and they would keep it there. Because eventually you would know your declensions. You don't need to memorize them. The teacher would start to ask questions about them after a while, and through the questioning and interaction with text, you'd learn your Latin. There are people around now who are able to read Latin properly, and by read I mean that the Latin that's going on inside their heads is Latin. They're not reading and translating rapidly into their home mother language as they're reading. But there aren't that many people like that. And those people that have got to this point, they have used two particular methods. One is Orberg's Lingua Latina per se illustrata, which is a reading method following a natural order. And the other text that does this is Adler, a practical grammar of the Latin language. There's a difference between the two. Adler is focused on speech, and the idea with Adler is that once you got to the end of a textbook, all 97 chapters of it, then you would start a reading course, going through a series of progressively more and more difficult Latin readers, until finally you would start to approach the classical texts themselves. This is the sort of order of language study you would follow if you were studying a modern language. You wouldn't suddenly jump into Molière or Racine if you were learning French. You start off with Le soleil brûle dans un ciel bleu, right? The sun is shining in a blue sky, les oiseaux chantent, and the birds are singing, and simple stuff like that. Nothing complicated. And so it should be with Latin language learning. To get to a very high level of fluency, you need to expose yourself through your eyes and through your ears to an enormous amount of the language. The problem with reading is that you have to sit at a table and do it. But we're all on the go these days. And I highly recommend the use of audio to advance your Latin. The advantage of audio is that, yes, you can read the text the first time through if you need to in print, but then with audio you can revise that text over and over and over again until the language of it is ingrained in you, and you will make rapid progress. You'll make far more rapid progress through continuous oral exposure and oral exposure, oral primarily being the most important thing, through your ears. Oral, either in your head, talking to yourself about the text you're listening to, or repeating phrases, either in your head or out loud, will enable you to make progress with the language. But if you see an ablative in a text and you start to query yourself what kind of ablative it is, you're not reading Latin. Don't kid yourself. A Roman speaking or a Roman writing, yes, he would be able to post facto analyze his writing, but the actual process of producing it, you can't think that fast. You can't produce language and analyze everything grammatically at the same time. Right now I'm speaking what I hope is reasonably grammatical English, but I could write down my sentence and then I could do a sentence diagram of it, but that's an intellectual exercise. It's philological. It's not actually to do with using the language, reading the language, and understanding it. If you speak to a lot of Latin teachers, and I've spoken to a rather large number of them, either through email or in real life, many of them look at you very strangely when you talk about what reading Latin means. Most Latin teachers think reading Latin means translating Latin into the mother tongue. This is not reading. If you were to speak to a French teacher and say, is reading French translating French into English, would you consider your French students to have succeeded if they could only understand a French novel if they sat down and translated it in writing or orally into English? And the answer would be, of course, no. The goal is to get them to read French, to approach the sentence naturally, and just to accept it as a French sentence. The advantage of audio is that you cannot analyze the material. You don't have time. You are forced to deal with it as it is. You are forced to take the structure of a Latin sentence and your brain has to just cope. This is a wonderful thing, and it builds fluency very fast. Latinum's got an enormous amount of material to help you get good at Latin. If your goal is to be able to read Latin texts independently, not have to use a dictionary, to be able to read Latin pretty much like you would read English, it will take you 5, 6, 7, 8 years maybe, 10 years to reach a reasonable level of fluency. But it can be done. And Latinum contains the materials to help you do it. What I've done is I've gone through a vast amount of material that exists online, increasingly so, and selected materials and put them into order in such a way that by using the materials on Latinum, you can acquire a very high level of Latin fluency, if that is your goal. Once you have it, or even when you're halfway there, you can join Scholar and start to participate in the small and growing community of those who are fluent in Latin. Scholar is probably the first time since the Renaissance that we have an ongoing daily Latin conversation taking place, a meeting of minds, people across the world logging into the chat room and talking in Latin. This hasn't happened consistently for a very long time. And Scholar also has brought over 2,000 scholars of the language together in the same place in a Latin language environment. And this itself hasn't happened. We've had, summer meetings and conventicular and things like that where people get together for a few weeks here and there. But to have a Latin environment that is there all the time, even though it's only virtual, is a new thing. And the level of skill of the people on Scholar, since it was founded in 2008, has been steadily increasing. People use Scholar in various ways. They talk to each other on it. They also use it as a springboard to have private chats. A lot of the interaction on Scholar takes place off the site. It's used as a place to find people. You can find people in your area, internationally, people who share common interests, etc. So it's quite useful. If you wish to become a highly skilled Latinist, if that's your goal, then Scholar can help you do that. Simply by giving you that little bit extra to push you a little bit further. But let's get back to this whole thing of how we learn Latin. Grammar is very important, but grammar should, at the very beginning of your studies, be grammar light, not grammar heavy. And then the more of a language that you know, the more of a language you're exposed to, when you finally start to learn grammar, you pick up a grammar book and start reading it, you think, yes, I know that construction. Yes, I know that construction. And examples spring to mind. In other words, the grammar should be studied after you already have an enormous amount of the language under your control. It'll be implicit, intuitive, and then learning the grammar later on will make it all explicit. Grammar is very important, but you are not going to learn the language from scratch by learning grammar. And so on the whole, there are very, very few people who speak Latin and who can write Latin who've learned using a system like Wheelock. Wheelock does not produce good readers of Latin. It does not produce speakers of Latin or those who can actually read the language. Those people who have used Wheelock and have taken the leap forward have either used Lingua Latina per se illustrata to push themselves into actually being able to read the language, or they've started to read extensively using the increasingly large amount of useful material that Google Books is throwing up as it scans the vast libraries of the world. So that's where we are. If you want to become very good at Latin, I would recommend two routes, or maybe both of them together: Adler and Lingua Latina per se illustrata. These two things work together very well. And then large amounts of listening. Comenius' Vestibulum, the Orbis Sensualium Pictus, to give yourself a very wide vocabulary. And perhaps swallowing the dictionary, which you can revise once a month or so, although that's quite hard going. It's not an easy recording to listen to. But it does do its job. And by applying yourself, as I said, by firing on all cylinders, by reading, by listening, by speaking, and also by writing, preferably by hand, doing all of these different things at the same time, or one after the other, obviously not at the exact same time, obviously, you will be able to advance your Latin and bring it up to a very high level. Vale. Bye. And final note, remember latinum.org.uk for Latinum's materials. Bye.